Hey friends, Matt here, and in this video I want to show you how you can create your very own bass growls and wubs using Ableton Live's Drift synthesizer and only audio effects that come in every single edition of Ableton Live, from light all the way through to suite, so no matter what edition you're in, you can follow along with this tutorial. Let's dive right in. Okay, so here I've got a blank Ableton Live session. First of all, what I'm going to do is just add a drift to this first MIDI track. I'm going to use this to create our sound. Now, by default, our drift sounds kind of basic and boring. We're going to fix that pretty quickly. So to simplify the start of the process here, what I'm going to do is just kind of reset our drift to the most initialized and basic state possible. To do this, I'm going to turn down the volume of Oscillator 2 all the way to 0. I'm going to come to the filter section and go to the frequency modulation section and just double click on this slider right here to remove the modulation, and also this slider right here to, again, remove the modulation. And so now our filter doesn't have any movement applied to it whatsoever if I start to adjust this filter frequency control. Next, let's go ahead and set our envelope 1 here to have it sustained all the way up at 100% and reduce the release to the minimum amount possible. And just to keep things even more straightforward, I'm going to go over to the right-hand side into the global section and just reduce this velocity to volume slider all the way down to 0%. So that means that the velocity of the incoming MIDI note is not going to affect the output volume of the synthesizer. And so now we have the most kind of basic default initialized drift preset that we could. We just have a simple saw wave running through a low pass filter and an on-off envelope with no velocity at all. And this is a great starting point for our bass growl. Now, first of all, I want to get that kind of bass growl wub movement. And to do this, we're going to move the low pass filter from low to high and then back again using the second envelope. So let's move our low pass filter all the way down to 20 Hertz. And now what I'm going to do is come down to this frequency modulation section. And in this first drop down menu, I want to make sure envelope 2 is selected. And then I'm just going to start to increase this modulation amount here. And what this is going to do is make it so that this second envelope is controlling the movement of this low pass filter frequency. Now, by default, because of the settings of this second envelope, we're going to get a more plucky than growly or wubby sound. We can change this really easily. Firstly, I'm just going to reduce the sustain of this second envelope all the way down to 0%. And now I'm just going to increase the attack of this second envelope so that we start to get a slower fade in and then a fade out on the envelope, and we start to get that kind of wubby movement. We can adjust the decay to suit as well. And there we have our kind of basic filter movement on this sound, which is going to give us that growly, wubby characteristic. Next, we need to create that more aggressive sound. And to do this, we're going to use Drift's LFO for some frequency modulation. To do this, I'm going to come over to the LFO section, and up the top in the rate section, I'm going to switch it to 1:1. And what this is going to do is make it so that the speed or rate of the LFO here is actually tied to effectively the rate of the oscillators of the synthesizer, playing at a ratio of that particular fundamental frequency that's giving us the pitch of the oscillators. Next, all we need to do is map this LFO to control the pitch of the oscillators. This is really easily done by just coming over to the bottom left-hand section of the device in this pitch mod area, going to the LFO mod, and just increasing this percentage slightly. And you can hear that as we adjust the percentage, we get a more interesting kind of sound. And now to adjust the characteristic of this frequency modulation, we can go back over to the LFO and just adjust the ratio here to whatever value that we like. Now, I do recommend setting this ratio to a whole number because it's going to be a little bit more tonally pleasing than any of these kind of decimal points. So you can try a whole number anywhere from 1 all the way up to 16 and just try out a few different ones. So we can have a listen to what 2 sounds like, 3, 4, or we could even try something like, I don't know, 10, or maybe go down to 8. And now we have that more kind of aggressive sound. From here, there's a bunch of different things we can do, and most of them involve using this second envelope that's already modulating the filter to modulate a bunch of other parameters inside of the synthesizer. The first thing that we could try to modulate is the high pass filter here. So let's increase the high pass filter. And now I'm gonna go ahead and have the envelope 2 here modulate this high pass filter so that it goes down and then back up over the course of the same time that the low pass filter is going up and then back down. To do this, I'm just gonna go ahead and go over to this LFO section, click on the Mod tab, and then here where it says Mod Wheel, I'm gonna click on this drop down, set this to envelope 2, leave this second drop down set to HP frequency or high pass filter frequency, and then I'm gonna set this percentage to a negative direction. And what this is gonna do is mean that the high pass filter is gonna have its cutoff frequency move from high to low, again over the same period of time that the low pass moves from low to high. And so now we get a little bit more movement in the sound. We could try different starting positions for this high pass filter. That's sounding pretty good to me. Next, we could also have the envelope control the amount of the LFO that's modulating the pitch, causing that frequency modulation. To do this, I'm gonna go to the LFO section, and down here we have this little amount slider. And all I'm gonna do with this is go to this mod dropdown, click here, select envelope 2 from the dropdown list, and now we can change this modulation amount to a positive direction. And what this is gonna do is adjust this modulation amount over time. Now we can change the kind of maximum amount with this amount slider here, and adjust the amount again of this modulation to taste. So you can hear how we're already kind of getting that movement growly type sound just by adding some modulation to a few simple parameters. Now from here, we can start to play around with the sound in a bunch of different ways to get different types of timbral characteristics. For example, we could go and change the oscillator from a sawtooth wave to something like a sine wave. And we could even go ahead and adjust this shape control as well. If we want to get a little bit more saturation out of this initial drift sound, we can also just increase the level of this oscillator up to 0 dB, and that's going to drive the filter section and add a little bit of harmonic distortion to the sound. If we want, we can even try and modulate this shape here on the oscillator with envelope 2 as well. So I could go and select this drop-down menu, select envelope 2, and adjust this slider here to have it so that envelope 2 is also modulating this shape control. And we can even see this movement reflected here in the oscilloscope, which is pretty cool. We can go ahead and maybe even add a second oscillator to layer in with this initial sound just by increasing this level of the oscillator 2 here. Set the octave to 0. Or we could even go ahead and set the octave to say +1 or +2 and just increase the detune up to 7 semitones so that we now have an octave and a fifth, or maybe 2 octaves and a fifth above oscillator 1, which can give it another interesting characteristic. We could even change the shape of oscillator 2 here to maybe something like a triangle wave. And again, change the basic characteristic of the sound. Next, we could adjust some characteristics of the filter, say increase the resonance, adjust the low position of the low pass filter, or even choose a different filter type by clicking on this type toggle right here. And we can also adjust the depth of the modulation that envelope 2 is applying to the filter frequency by adjusting this modulation amount here to get kind of a more open or less open sound. I kind of like it at about 90%. We can also adjust the timbral characteristics in a more drastic way by changing the shape of the LFO from something like sine to a different shape, maybe like a sawtooth or a triangle wave, for example. So let's go ahead and go to this sine wave drop-down menu here, select triangle, have a listen to what that sounds like. Now let's try out something like saw up. And you can really hear how that drastically changes the timbral characteristics of this sound by choosing a different LFO waveform. Let's try something like saw down. And even adjust the ratio to maybe something like, I don't know, 10. Go back to the triangle. And lastly, to give this sound a little bit more width and space, I'm going to go ahead to the mode section over here. And from the drop-down menu, I can select either the stereo or the unison mode, and that's going to give us a little bit more stereo width. The stereo will give us kind of a cleaner stereo width, and adjusting this first slider will give us some more stereo spread. And adjusting the drift parameter will give us some even more variation from note to note. Or we could go ahead and try out the unison mode, which is going to give us a little bit more of a detuned characteristic, which can be quite a cool sound. By the way, I've just released a 1.5 hour long mini course that goes through the fundamentals of bass sound design for electronic music. This course covers all the different types of basses that you might find in electronic music, from things like sub bass all the way through to growls and wubs. You can find out more information in the links in the description and grab the course for only 25 Australian dollars. Now, of course, from here, you could go and adjust all of the different elements that we've talked about so far, but let's look at adding some audio effects to really enhance this sound even further. The first really simple and quite drastic audio effect that I'm going to add is a saturator, which is available in every single edition of Ableton Live. Let me show you what it can do to the sound. So let's go ahead and add Ableton Live's saturator after this drift device here. And next, all I'm going to do is just start to increase the drive of the saturator here, which is going to start to apply some distortion to the sound. And you can hear that's really bringing out a lot of the more growly characteristics of the sound. We can also try out some different saturation modes. For instance, I might want to try out this bass shaper mode, which was introduced in Live 12.1. Adjust the threshold control a little bit. And I can even play around with the color mode just by engaging the color mode here and tuning this amount low, either in a negative or positive direction. I find for this it works quite well if you increase the percentage, which basically increases the amount of saturation applied to the lower frequencies over the higher frequencies, which can get a really cool result for this type of sound. Pretty cool stuff. Next, let's adjust the output just to compensate for how loud we're making this sound. And now we can look at adding some even more interesting effects that add a little bit more movement and space to the sound. First, let's start with a simple auto filter. I'm going to put this auto filter after the saturator, and I'm going to set this auto filter to the notch filter type, and then adjust the filter frequency down a little bit, and you can already hear what this is doing to the sound. Now what I want to actually do is have it so that this notch filter moves kind of with the sound. To do this, I can actually just use the envelope section of this auto filter device, move this envelope depth control or amount control in a negative direction, and that's going to make it so that this filter frequency goes from the position it's at, moves down, and then comes back to the position it's at, following the kind of movement or shape of the incoming sound. You can play around with having this filter either after or before the saturator. In this particular instance, I think it works a little bit better after the saturator. And we could also even add a little bit more distortion to the sound by coming over to the filter, selecting the filter type dropdown and selecting OSR, and then just increasing the drive a little bit in the filter. You can hear it's adding a little bit more crunch and distortion to the sound. Now, you could also achieve a similar characteristic by using an effect like a phaser. For instance, let's go ahead and add Ableton Live's phaser flanger after this auto filter, reduce the amount, make sure this LFO envelope section is open up by clicking on this top left arrow right here. And then we could do that same trick of having the phaser follow the envelope of the sound by using this envelope follower section, again in a negative direction. We can adjust the center frequency of the phaser, adjust the spread, even adjust the number of notches, and potentially even increase the feedback to adjust the drasticness of this effect. And then if it's a little bit too much, we can just back off the dry wet here to just have it a little bit in the sound instead. Don't forget, at any point we can go back and adjust the initial sound. So for instance, I might think it's opening up a little bit too much, and I could reduce this frequency modulation down to, say, 75%. Maybe even reduce this resonance of the filter. And you could also even experiment with changing the waveform again to see how all of these different effects actually now change the sound based on the new waveform. For instance, I could change Oscillator 1 to a triangle wave, or a sawtooth wave again, or maybe even a more interesting wave like this. And if you want to make sure that each individual press of a note is exactly the same, we can just engage the Retrigger option for the oscillator here and also for the LFO here. And that's going to make it so that each new note sounds basically identical to the previous one because they're all starting at the exact same point. Lastly, we could go ahead and add some reverb, maybe just a little bit instead of a huge decay. And then you could add some EQ and compression to kind of shape and bring the sound together just a little bit nicer. Let's go ahead and add a channel EQ, pull down the mids a little bit, adjust the mid section, increase the highs, and add some compression with Ableton Live's compressor, pull down the threshold, increase the output, and adjust the attack and release times to get something that works really well for the envelope of the sound that we've got. For instance, here I might have a little bit of a slower attack and a slower release. And maybe increase the knee just a little bit so that we have a little bit more gentle compression across the entirety of the sound. And so from here, you can experiment with adding more interesting effects, things like choruses, more distortion, more compression, EQ, filtering, etc. Or even go back and change some things in the initial synthesizer, layer it with a sub bass, whatever you feel like the sound is missing or whatever you want to try, give it a shot and see how it sounds. Otherwise, that is how you can create your very own bass growls and wubs using Ableton Live's Drift and only stock Ableton Live devices. If you want to learn more about bass sound design, you can check out my Bass Sound Design Fundamentals course with the link in the description. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned something, stay awesome, and I'll see you all in the next video.